Because there's an interesting study that you guys are sharing on there where, there are detrimental effects for folks getting under 2 grams of sodium per day. And then we don't see that same detrimental effect on the high side until we get up to or above 8 grams per day, which I thought was fascinating to see.
And that was in a type 2 diabetic heart patient population.
So compromised people.
Compromised people, folks that you would assume that if low sodium was the bee's knees, we would see it. Yeah, and we saw the opposite.
And that's just, it's so amazing to see that. And so, you mentioned earlier, your word, the boogeyman, like, is such a great encapsulation of kind of the psyche that most people have around, sodium. So, how did we get to this place where the average person thinks of sodium as the boogeyman? And I know education is the answer of how do we, change that, but I'm hoping for something a little bit beyond education from you as an answer there.
Yeah, I've struggled on a concise answer to this, and I think I've gotten closer to this over time, but we know that hypertension is a really nasty process with regards to cardiovascular disease risk, kidney damage. But having high blood pressure is bad news. And I would actually say that the blood pressure values that most of medicine accepts as normal is actually pathological. Like, normal blood pressure should be lower than what people are generally talking about to really avoid the main problems of cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, stroke, all that type of stuff. And without a doubt, sodium plays a role in that whole story. If our body retains sodium, it retains water, and we will generally have higher blood volume, and that can lead to hypertension or elevated blood pressure. The problem in this whole story, though, is that the reason why most people retain excess sodium is due to overeating, and overeating carbohydrates in particular, which causes us to upregulate the production of a hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone causes the kidneys to retain sodium. So this is an insulin-driven problem that has been blamed on sodium. And this is where, when we look at the low-sodium diet interventions, like these DASH diet interventions, it barely changes blood pressure. Like, they put people on nearly zero sodium diets, and but they're still eating a lot of carbs. And I'm not in that like insulin hypothesis camp a la Gary Taubes, but I do acknowledge that different folks are differing levels of carb tolerant, and they can have excessive insulin responses from different amounts and types of carbs. And so these folks, they switch them to a low sodium diet, but they're still eating too many carbs for what their physiology does best with, and they retain sodium. And so we don't really see much in the way of benefit of a low sodium diet. But holy smokes, if you get people on a low carb diet, what's the first thing that we tell people is going to happen? Oh, you're going to start peeing like crazy, and you might even get dizzy from low blood pressure. And this is where the low carb, or even just a moderate or largely unprocessed carbohydrate diet, is so powerful in normalizing blood pressure. You get a lot of magnesium and potassium, which are helpful for normalizing blood pressure under these circumstances where you're eating a whole food, minimally processed diet. But then also you're dramatically reducing glycemic load. So the sodium piece, again, got blamed because mechanistically sodium is absolutely involved in hypertension, but it's like a bystander. It's not the causative factor. The causative factor is that hyperinsulinemic state. Once we fix that hyperinsulinemia, what we find is that people tend to really benefit from then increasing sodium intake. And it's worth mentioning that, like, the Japanese population is, most people have heard about, like, the French paradox, where they eat lots of fat and they don't have the cardiovascular disease that we have. There's this Japanese paradox too, where the average sodium intake was 10 grams per day historically. This is nearly 5 times what that of the recommendation for the United States, but yet their rates of cardiovascular disease, stroke, et cetera, are minimal compared to ours. It's changing now as they eat more and more sugar. Their carbohydrate amount hasn't changed, but the amount of sugar, specifically sugary drinks, has increased, and they're starting to experience hyperinsulinemia. And if you do a hyperinsulinemic environment plus a high sodium historical diet, that is absolutely going to be a disaster for the Japanese going forward. Like that is definitely throwing gas on the fire. But again, this is kind of a nuanced deal. It's not just salt. It's not just the carbs. It's kind of these circumstantial things that all come together.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. One of the other things that is on that research page is the amount of water that we lose through sweat, and I don't have that in front of me, so I don't recall if it was for active people or if it was just for average people, but 4 to 10 liters of water per day. I think that's another number that's going to be a lot higher than what most people would have guessed.
Right, yeah, and I mean when you look at we've done some work with, say, like some NHL teams, and they look at, these are big dudes, 200 plus pounds, and they will lose, their super sweaters will lose up to 10 pounds of water in a hard game or practice session, and 10 grams of sodium associated with that water loss. And what's interesting is they lose almost no potassium or magnesium relative to the sodium excretion. And this is why we focus so heavily on the sodium repletion part of this, particularly for athletes, because the problem, yes, magnesium important, people don't get enough of it. Yes, potassium's important, people generally don't get enough of it, both because people eat too much refined food, but in that scenario of overtraining, or not overtraining, but just hard training and water and electrolyte loss, sodium is really where the main story is.
Yeah, and I heard you guys talk about this on another one of your Healthy Rebellion radio episodes, that you guys chose to do 200 milligrams of potassium in your formula. There are, at least to my knowledge, there's another electrolyte company that has the same amount of sodium as Element, but they have 500 milligrams of potassium. And for folks who eat the typical high protein, low carb diet, we're going to get a lot of potassium from our food. And like you just pointed out, we may not lose as much of that through sweat. So, that's another reason that I prefer the Element electrolytes as opposed to the other ones, because I don't want to overdo it on the potassium side.
Yeah, and folks can, and this is something that is kind of counterintuitive, but is a real deal problem. It is, our physiology is much more forgiving of getting too much sodium versus too little. And again, this is kind of counterintuitive, but it's people will die from hyponatremia, from low sodium. You can also have problems from low hypokalemia, the low potassium levels, but it's harder to get to that point. And like over drinking water without electrolytes in it is one of the prime ways that we can dilute the sodium potassium ratio in a way that could be dangerous or life threatening. And again, what's interesting, if we looked at it from kind of a toxicology perspective, the body does a really good job of dealing with too much sodium. About 30 minutes after consuming that excess sodium, it's been filtered out and we're good to go. But if we are deficient in sodium, what the body has to do is start shedding potassium to reestablish that sodium potassium ratio. And this begins a downward spiral, which can kill people. And so we actually, if I was completely honest, I would say that I would have ideally released Element without any potassium in it at all, but nobody would have bought it. And so it's kind of like a sterile fruit fly release. It's like we put it in there to pacify folks, but we didn't put enough in there that it would upset the apple cart on the amount that they actually need.